I'm going to call Dr Megan Woods.
Chairman, and it's my pleasure to take a short call on part one of this legislation because, Mr Chairman, part one is a very important part of this legislation, and that it's where the definitions of a number of the issues that we're dealing with are very clearly laid out. And Mr Chairman, as my colleagues who have spoken before me have mentioned, that Labor is supporting this legislation, that we think that it's vitally important that we get this right. And critical to getting this right are the provisions laid out in clauses 4 through 8A, which are where we're doing the definitional work. And Mr Chairman, it was the work of the Select Committee when it came to consider much of the definitional changes that needed to be made, that actually some of the hard work that we see of the committee actually was here. If we have a look at the change that the Select Committee made to the definition of construction site in clause 5 of the bill, that it was that as it relates to related services, to include the land where work is planned but not yet begun. And Mr Chairman, this is vitally important, that this is captured, so that work may well be in plan, but that it had not yet begun, that is going to be captured by this legislation. So I think this was a very important change that the Select Committee made to clause 5 in part 1 of this legislation. If we then turn our attention to clause 6, Mr Chairman, where the amendment was made at Select Committee to add operations that are critical for the completion on or preparatory to the scope of design, engineering and quantity surveying work to the definition of construction work. Again, that we had to have a very clear understanding of just what it was that is meant by construction work when we go to consider the more principal parts of this legislation that are contained in part 2. So this addition, the scope, design, engineering and QS work is vitally important, that we understand that as part of the construction cycle, and that we're making sure that we are offering the protections that are going to be offered in other parts of this legislation in this way. And the Select Committee didn't just stop there, Mr Chairman. They went through the definitions with a fine-tooth comb. When they came to clause 7.2, where they staggered the commencement date for the Act as it would apply to related services to 1 November 2015, so that where it was sensible that there was a staggering of the commencement of these provisions as it made sense under the Act. And then, of course, the work the committee did in including new clause, subclause 7.3 and new clause 32 that inserted a schedule into the Act, which made it clear that the amendments proposed in this legislation would apply only to contracts entered into or renewed on or after the commencement date. And this was a very important change that the Select Committee made, Mr Chairman, because of course it is, I think, a principle of good legislation, that we are not retrospectively legislating, that we are legislating forward, and that we are changing the rules from the date of the commencement of the legislation and not having a retrospective bill. And I think that's something, that change that the Select Committee made there to subclause 7 was vitally important. And the last change, of course, Mr Chairman, that the Select Committee made in part 1 of this Act was to insert new clause 8A, which excluded contract provisions for the sale and purchase of second-hand assets and property management where they are part of a contract that includes construction work. So this was excluded from the Act. And there were deliberations at the Select Committee that made it very clear why this needed to be excluded from the Act. And Mr Chairman, all these changes, that while they may seem minor, and there may be a temptation even, Mr Chairman, to gloss over these and not think them important, the key to getting this legislation right is having very clear definitions and having very clear definitions of what we're talking about. And I think that the amendments of the Select Committee that I've spoken about in my contribution tonight, Mr Chairman, make it very clear just how important that those amendments are. So when we're talking about to related services to include the land where work is planned but not yet begun, this is of course a very important part of the construction cycle, that planning is vitally important and that there is always going to be work to be done. So, Mr Chairman, I commend the work that the committee did in clearing up many of the definitions in this bill.